Hey guys, welcome to my freaking podcast. I am Alexandra Jones-Stadell, and this is Anthropology Fast Facts. Episode 1. It's going to be all about Iceland. I'm super freaking excited about it. So first, we're going to start out by exploring Icelandic history and culture, and we're going to think about that through space and place. Keep that in mind. Then we're going to think about the tourist boom of 2008 and how it's changing Iceland. Cool. And also, within that tourist boom, we're going to talk about performative culture and linking that to souvenirs and stuff like that. So it's a lot to unpack, and we're going to start with the basics. What's that? That's a freaking key term alert. We're going to define some things for context. Remember, I told you to keep in mind space and place, right? We're going to define that right now. We're going to do that in a metaphor. So we're going to think of location or a country or something as a glass jar, right? Like a mason jar. Think of your favorite, hipster coffee shop, and they probably sell things in mason jars, or, Pinterest. And so space is going to be the jar itself, and place is what we fill it with. Like, it's the cold brew and the cream. You know what I'm saying? And the process of placemaking is making a space into a place, or filling the jar with the stuff, the cold brew, the cream. And what do we call that stuff? That stuff is actually culture, language, tradition, family, things that people of a place all kind of have in common. So culture, the feeling, is the material and social reaction to our surroundings and environment. And it's tied inseparably to space because it's the human reaction to space. So performative culture is tied to space and place because it's essentially how people perform and present their culture to outsiders through advertising and interacting with others. And the clearest example of this is in souvenirs. What pieces of culture, space, and place are so essential to people that those things are decided as the things that people will bring with them, the small pieces of a place that they will see and remember their time there. So questions come with that, as in what pieces of culture are chosen and which ones are left out. And that's almost the more important question, is thinking about which pieces of culture are left out. And so you might, be talking to people, be like, oh, hey, I just got back from Iceland. And freaking everyone has been to Iceland. So one person over here is like, oh, cool, I've been to Iceland and I got a bar soap with northern lights on it. And someone else is like, I got a Viking mug. And then this other guy's like, I got a bracelet with a rune on it. And you can be like, yeah, you're not special. These days, everyone has freaking been to Iceland. Iceland is a country of about 330,000 people, 79% of which work in the service industry, which mainly services tourists. So Iceland is marketed as a stopover, a space of placelessness, forever filled with impermanent people, but that wasn't always the case. So we're going to go back and take a brisk jog through Icelandic history for a second, so that we can think critically about what happened to Iceland in 2008 that caused it to become the heavy-hitting tourist destination that it is now. And also, we have to look at the culture so that we can see why Iceland markets itself the way that it does. So, let's take a look back. Actually, we don't have to go too far back because Iceland is one of the youngest countries, geologically speaking. It popped up out of the ocean only about 20 million years ago, and governmentally speaking, it became independent of Denmark in 1944, so that was pretty recent too. But in between those two events, a lot happened. So first, arguably, there were Gaelic monks in Iceland, and then came the Vikings and their slaves from Norway and Britain. And now we've got names that I'm not going to be able to pronounce, but Hrana Floki Vilgårdsson was one of the OG Vikings. He sailed to Iceland and was most likely the first to see it in the summer in order to see its habitable potential. And he went back to Norway spreading the good news of Icelandic potential. And people started to go, but nobody ever wanted to stay, which was really sad. Until, some people decided Iceland was actually kind of okay, and maybe they should give living there a try. It couldn't suck worse than anywhere else, they thought. At this time, Iceland was covered in about 25% of trees, and nowadays only 1% is covered. So, in the time where people started populating it to nowadays, 24% of the trees were cut down and they never grew back because after the trees were cut down, the soil all escaped, which is, a space and place issue, because if you don't have like great soil, you're not going to be able to grow a lot of things. And that really relates to culture, because another important part of culture is food. So if you can't grow a lot of things, you kind of have to work with what you have. They had a lot of grass, so they have a lot of sheep and cows. They're surrounded by water, so they get a lot of, fish. And those are kind of big in Icelandic culture. But those first people who decided to populate the island were probably Ingolfur Arnarsson and Halvig Froðadóttir. And there was some argument about that. They're thinking maybe it was one of Gordar Svarvarsson's men who decided to stay on the island after Gordar Svarvarsson circumnavigated it. But mainly people think that it was Ingolfur Arnarsson and his wife Halvig Froðadóttir. And once Ingolfur, yeah, that guy. Once he got there, and he named and settled in Reykjavik, people decided that they wanted in on this action, and the entire country, or the habitable parts at least, which is genuinely just the coastline, so the circumference of Iceland, the entire center part is completely uninhabited. But that was all settled by the end of the 9th century, and the settlers were mostly from Norway, and their slaves were from Ireland and Scotland. Now you may be thinking, how the heck do we know all this stuff? That happened within the 10th century. We know it because of the sagas. Duh, yeah. Back in the day, they wrote everything that happened in Iceland down in these books called the sagas. And there wasn't too much to keep track of, so it was a relatively easy job. And archaeological evidence has confirmed a lot of what's been said in the sagas, so it would seem that they're kind of surprisingly accurate. And now we're here. We made it. It's the year 930 and Iceland is established. Awesome. But now what? Well, they needed a government. So enter Alþingi, probably the world's oldest parliament. They made laws which were memorized by the elected law speaker instead of written down. There were a lot of feuds since there was no executive power and people were expected to enforce their laws by themselves. And this mentality persists in the Icelanders of today. You're very much responsible for your own safety and the consequences of your own actions. Unfortunately, during this time, there was a lot of fighting for power amongst the people, so they needed a central power to keep everyone else in check. Enter Norway. Iceland agreed to a union with the Norwegian monarchy, but that didn't last too long because the male in line for the throne of Norway died, and the Dutch were like, found yourselves in a bit of a pickle, did ya? We can totally help you out. And Norway was like, yeah, okay, what could go wrong? And Iceland was like, dude, a lot could go wrong. But they didn't have much say in the matter, so Iceland joined the Kalmar Union in 1415 and remained under Dutch rule until 1944. You're thinking, oh my god, that's a long time. And I'm telling you, yeah, it's totally a long time. And a lot happened during that time. But this is supposed to be a brief recap of history, and it's getting a little too long. So we're going to hit all the major points of the next 500 years or so in a song. The soil was infertile because they cut down all the trees. Volcanoes were erupting, causing a whole lot of disease. Speaking of disease, the Black Death came a-knocking twice, killing all the children, population quickly dropping. Pirates raped and pillaged, some say that's Viking karma. Trade became restricted, bad luck for all the farmers. The 18th century came around, bringing smallpox and famine. The temperatures were dropping, at least they still had salmon. Lots of people left the island, 21% to be exact. Now Iceland wanted freedom, but the rule of Denmark was intact. They got their constitution in 1874, but it wasn't quite enough. Iceland wanted more. They wanted a republic, so that is what they got. 1944 came. The republic is what it brought. And that, my friends, was a really fast history of Iceland in a song. All right, so now we're at 1944. And then after that, there were two very different wars that Iceland was involved in that aren't that important, but I'm going to mention it because it's kind of funny. They were involved in the Cold War and the Cod War, which is a one-letter difference, but don't get it twisted. They were totally different things. I'm sure you know what the Cold War was, and Iceland was involved because it was the perfect location, right between North America and Europe. And so because of this and because of its proximity to, Russia and Norway and America and kind of everything, it was a great spot for soldiers to stay. So they were involved in the Cold War, but they were also involved in the Cod War, which is a war over fishing rights. Very different. So we're going to skip ahead a bit and we're going to go to 2003 where the theme was Dollar Dollar Bill Y'all. Ah yes, 2003 to 2007. A time of economic prosperity for Iceland. Banks became privatized and they were making all kinds of international investments. Unfortunately, most of these ended up falling through, causing a huge financial crisis in 2008. Also in 2008, a really big volcano exploded, and now we're going to listen to some newscasters mispronouncing the volcano's name.
It's Eyjafjallajökull.
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 Eyjafjallajökull. Eyjafjallajökull.
Eyjafjallajökull. Eyjafjallajökull.
Eyjafjallajökull. Eyjafjallajökull. Eyjafjallajökull.
Yeah, so that was sad. And now here's the actual way that you pronounce the name of the volcano from an Icelandic man.
It's Eyjafjallajökull.
So, Eyjafjallajökull. I definitely said that wrong. But not only was that sort of a funny example, it's also relevant to the further discussion, because did you notice how many news sources from all over the world were trying and failing to pronounce Eyjafjallajökull? Definitely didn't say that right again. But it's because the volcano eruption caused major flight cancellations and delays to Europe at the time. So Iceland was plastered all over the news, and they were seeing pictures of this beautiful, untouched land. And people were like, wait a second, that place is kind of beautiful, so untouched, so natural. Let's go there and mess it all up. And the rest of the world was like, yeah, totally, let's go and mess it up. I mean, that wasn't really their actual goal, but when you take a beautiful place with only 300,000 people and add 2 million more people all at once, things tend to get a little messed up. But we'll get to that later on. Now you might be thinking, hey, didn't a volcano just erupt there? Why would people want to go to a place that's very clearly kind of dangerous? Well, that's exactly why. Iceland was smart, and they decided to market their land as dangerous and unpredictable. New, unexplored nature in the most extreme sense. For the travelers and the wanderers who want authenticity and sights and experiences unlike anything they could find in the rest of the world, it's the land of the extremes. Glaciers and volcanoes. 24 hours of sunlight in the summer, 24 hours of darkness in the winter. Arctic foxes and giant humpback whales, geysers erupting, mountains people could scale, waterfalls, fjords, crazy displays of nature in the form of the northern lights. The danger was always part of the allure. Iceland Air heavily promoted its stopover feature where a person flying from any country to mainland Europe could stop and stay in Iceland for up to 7 days. No extra costs added onto the flight. Iceland's positionality, so space, in between North America and Europe was a perfect location to be marketed as the halfway point with beautiful scenic nature and a wild, untamed culture of Viking ancestors, exploding volcanoes, something you had to see to believe, and so people came flocking. And as we know, Iceland has all this culture, all this really specific and unique history. So what are they going to do with it at this point? Promote it. There are attractions centered around the Vikings, the sagas, traditional Icelandic foods like lumpfish, shark, and sheep balls, all of which are deeply tied to space as I explained before. Iceland doesn't have much, so they promote the heck out of what they do have. You will see tourists walking down the streets of Reykjavik with hiking poles, because that's how Iceland was marketed to them. You see advertisements everywhere for geothermal hot springs, northern light recreations, whale watching tours, horseback riding excursions, museums dedicated to witchcraft and the paganism of Iceland's past, cruise ships with hundreds of tourists flocking into tiny towns in the West Fjords to experience authentic Icelandic living for a day or two. You've got American and Chinese tourists in extremely expensive traditional Icelandic sweaters. You've got waterfalls with bathrooms and parking lots set up at the base, etc., etc., etc. And where is this performance and promotion of culture most evident? In the souvenirs that Icelandic people have chosen to represent their country for the tourists to bring home and show their friends. Viking keychains and mugs, puffin and Arctic fox stuffed animals, polar bear merchandise, even though there are no polar bears in Iceland, Icelandic moss tea, salt made from volcano rock, images of natural landscapes like sheep and glaciers, all for people to buy and show as they walk the streets of what is actually a very modern European city with a Brooklyn-type hipster feel. And a lot of tourists don't visit the glaciers or waterfall or the open stretches of arid land at the center of the country. They stay in towns and cities and occasionally venture out to the heavily promoted natural tourist traps like the Blue Lagoon or the geysers. And yet they take home souvenirs all reminiscent of untouched wild landscape and people like the Vikings were. Modern Iceland is in its actual essence the myth of wilderness embodied. And these trinkets promote the distillation of culture. It's sort of like taking culture and then like pushing it down, and you're watering it down. And I don't know, it's kind of like, think of culture as the almond and the freaking trinkets as the almond milk, right? It's all been watered down, kind of crushed up in a way that's, easily palatable. And that's kind of what trinkets and souvenirs are. And that's how Iceland kind of markets itself as this in-between place of crazy adventure, but also like this really cool culture, but it's all sort of performative. It's super interesting. Now we're going to kind of get into what this is doing to Iceland as a country. If you've ever been to a small town in the West Fjords called Ísafjörður, Iceland, while a cruise ship was docked there, you might have noticed a sort of hazy quality to the air. This is because the fumes from the cruise ship are pushed into the air and they sit there for weeks after the cruise ship has actually already left the town. Iceland's tourist appeal is that it's untouched and natural and beautiful. It's one of the few places left in the world where you get the feeling of being in actual wilderness. Even though wilderness doesn't really exist because nothing is untouched, Iceland is about as wild as it gets these days. And that's why people come. But the people coming in masses to the country is destroying everything that makes it marketable, its beauty and its simplicity. The more tourists there are, the more trash there is, the more greenhouse gases are burned, the more buildings need to be built, the more attractions need to be created, the more stuff there needs to be, and the less untouched nature there is for tourists and Icelanders to enjoy. Icelandic tourism has recently hit a plateau, much to the delight of the majority of everyday Icelanders who see their country being polluted by the outsiders. It's interesting to think what Iceland and its tourism industry that their economy has come to rely so heavily on will look like in 20 years after peak carrying capacity for tourists has been reached. Will people move on to find another hot new destination, or will the natural beauty of Iceland be swept away under the feet of visitors? Only time will tell.